Welcome to Big Data, Big Conversation, a candid conversation with a panel from Drexel University discussing their institution's engagement with learning outcomes assessment. My name is Andrew McCann. I'm the founder and CEO of Waypoint Outcomes. The data and story you're going to learn about today happened through the dedication and vision of many educators at Drexel, but it is fair to say that the story wouldn't have happened without Waypoint in place to help gather meaningful data through a variety of methodologies. I invite anyone joining us today to visit our website to watch a 2-minute video that does a wonderful job of explaining our teaching and learning solution. You can also sign your institution up for the free teaching and learning edition of Waypoint. After introductions and some housekeeping, the panel will walk you through 3 very different but interconnected assessment and teaching challenges. We'll finish with a question and answer session. Our panel today features Dr. Rebecca Ingalls, Dr. Karen Knowlton, and Dr. Scott Warnock. We're delighted that nearly 900 educators representing more than 23 countries were able to register for today's event. Because of the numbers of people attending, we ask that you type questions into the appropriate place in your web console. We'll use these questions to structure the Q&A after the formal presentation. You can download a copy of today's slides via a button on your console. Today's presentation and Q&A is being recorded. You'll receive an email with the link to the recording that you can share with colleagues or come back to for your own reference later. Assessment of learning is certainly a challenging topic. We asked registrants to this webinar 2 questions, and the answers illustrate unscientifically the maturity level of institutions around the topic of assessment. Nearly 50% of you self-identified as being in an initial or exploratory phase. Only 7% described their institution as having mature processes around assessment. We spend a lot of our time thinking about how to help institutions move up that maturity model and build assessment capabilities. The comments you made when registering illustrate the challenges to authentic engagement with learning outcomes, challenges around resources, faculty buy-in, creating a culture of assessment, making assessment meaningful rather than a layered-on process, and many other related topics. Many of these challenges connect to writing in one form or another. Teaching and assessing writing is hard, is academically adrift, and many subsequent articles have pointed out. But this work is the gateway to critical thinking, communication, and other hugely important competencies. Writing is also a way to engage educators across an institution in a common cause. As we prepared for today's session, we began thinking about writing as the lifeblood of meaningful assessment on campus. Our format today will take you through 3 interconnected assessment initiatives following a pattern, describing first the scenario that provided the impetus for the work, then the implementation details, an example of the resulting data, and finally the action that resulted, the closing of the assessment loop. Please feel free to type your questions via your web interface as we're talking. And at this time, I'll hand the presentation over to Dr. Scott Warnock so we can begin in earnest. Dr. Warnock?
Thank you, Andrew. Because this is a story about a particular place, or these are stories about a particular place, I want to start out just by telling everyone a little bit about Drexel University. Drexel's a pretty good-sized university, around 20,000 students. It's a comprehensive research institution with a number of doctoral programs. Drexel is well known for having a very strong cooperative education program, and while Drexel was founded as a technology and engineering school, and then it grew into having a very strong business program, it's now a very academically diverse place with a strong College of Arts and Sciences, of which we all reside, and a strong College of Media Arts and Design, a law school, a medical school, a number of well-known programs, including a lot of online offerings. In terms of this being about a particular place, Drexel has a number of advantages that worked hard for us in terms of these stories, I believe. One is we have a very robust writing program, freshman writing program, sorry. Our writing program administrators, Rebecca and I, were both very interested in assessment. Others around the university are as well. We have an in-house writing assessment expert, which many places don't have, and that's Karen. We have a very supportive administration in terms of resources, in terms of pedagogical buy-in for the things we've done. And frankly, we had Waypoint Outcomes already licensed and in place, which helped us do everything we've done here. We've made a number of good campus partners and had a lot of people who are very open to the idea of not just assessment, but writing assessment. For us as well, Middle States is on the horizon, and this accreditation impetus has provided us with a great way to have conversations about assessments. We've seen that as an advantage for us. In terms of assessment, we try to think of assessment in some ways as a long-distance race, and there's a number of challenges in that race, and I'm sure many of the people listening can relate to that. First of all, if you're going to do an assessment of any kind, you need clearly articulated outcomes, in other words, something to measure. Of course, money is always a factor, Things like institutional partnerships, that is finding other people to work with around the institution to do complex assessments. Having a workable plan, and not just a plan, but having a workable assessment system, technology that works with that system in terms of data gathering and statistics, and personnel requirements. Most assessments do require personnel, and stickiness, meaning, will the assessment mean something down the line? So in thinking of this as a race, the bottom line is it's very challenging to get to the finish line, and there are a lot of opportunities to basically drop out of the race along the way. So in thinking about that, as we move into our first scenario, we're going to describe a first-year humanities scenario that's kind of the first step of these stories. At Drexel, we have a 3-course writing sequence, 3 required freshman writing courses. Initially, when this assessment began, these were designed around an engineering design and humanities course that was for all engineering students at Drexel, and now this is kind of morphed into the composition courses that we now have that all students are required to take. The focus for the teaching team that taught these courses helped us do this. There was a focus on teaching in these courses, meaning people were very invested in the teaching that was going on in these classrooms. There's a lot of collaboration, a lot of team spirit, I think, in the old humanities program and in the current freshman writing program. There's a number of drives for consistency in the program, like a recognition of trying to have consistent outcomes, of trying to have students have a similar experience as they travel through these 3 courses, and a very strong interest in the feedback to students and the documentation of that feedback. These, again, are freshman writing courses where there's a great deal of interaction between faculty and students about the students' writing. So there was a desire to improve that feedback, to also keep records of that feedback in some way. The data I'm going to show you in this scenario, this is real data from students enabled by Waypoint. In other words, teachers used Waypoint software and Waypoint rubrics to give feedback to their students. So this is responses, measurement of real teachers to real students about their real assignments. This was not an assessment that was created externally from the program. As I said, the backbone of the template rubrics for this were created and shared via Waypoint. Some faculty use these every time. Others did in different ways. Some of it was ad hoc in terms of the usage of it. All the data you're going to see here is retrospectively gathered. This is looking back through 7 years of data that was assembled throughout, again, these real interactions between teachers and students. Last year, after looking back on this, an undergraduate research co-op assistant of mine mined this data, going through it, normalizing it in some way so that we could get the many, many data points that we're going to share with you briefly here. In terms of that data, again, this is data from actual course activity, ranging from 2004 to 2010. And what you're seeing here in this slide, there's 160 unique assignments or rubrics are represented in over 200 classes, spanning from English 101, which is our fall course, through 102, the winter course, to English 103. 30 instructors took part in this, and there's over 4,500 students represented by these data points. Now, with a little Waypoint nomenclature, there are 948 elements, and elements are the criteria. That's the name for the rubric criteria in Waypoint, such as thesis, style, organization. Now, these elements in Waypoint are matched to underlying competencies, which allow teachers to have individual styles in terms of their teaching. For instance, I might call something thesis. Rebecca might call it main idea. Karen might call it focus. But all of those criteria roll up to the competency called thesis. So what you're looking at in this data is a progression upward from English 101 to 103 based on teachers' evaluations of their students' actual projects. In blue, you see research and evidence. That we identified here because, perhaps strikingly, that was the lowest element. And if you ask people in a typical rubric that includes things like thesis, grammar mechanics, organization, all the variety of things that, through which we evaluate writing, you perhaps would not choose use of research and evidence as the overall lowest element. Yet that was true for us, and as you'll see, as we describe later, there were some connections with this across campus for us because we had this data. In terms of action going forward with this, we were able to gather this data and basically generate a lot of conversations about it, which is, of course, an underlying theme of what we're doing here. The data allowed us to, by just having this data, allowed us to institute some curricular changes in our program. Number one, at one point, research and evidence was primarily emphasized in English 102 in the winter term. But when it became evident to us that research and evidence was the place where our students struggled the most, we were able to move all of that into English 101. That enabled us, of course, libraries are invested in research and evidence, and that enabled us to build some strong collaborative interactions with our library on campus, again, generated around the fact that we didn't just have anecdotal evidence that students were struggling. Based on these rubrics of thousands and thousands of data points, we were showing that our students, this is where they really struggled and really needed help. We were also able to gear faculty development around it because we were able to show faculty that this was where our students, again, this is a large program. It's a large university, and we have about 150 sections of freshman writing. So to motivate faculty to see that this was really a problem, the data was a tremendously helpful piece. Also, politics and institutional culture, which I'll just touch on here, but anyone who's listening who's involved with general ed or with any kind of freshman writing program understands that these programs can often be forgotten in the institutional big picture. And by having even just the data gathering exploration helped us to have conversations with administrators and other stakeholders across the university about what we were doing. So the question is, how do you get what your faculty and program deserve? And we felt by demonstrating that, if you look back at this previous slide again, that we were showing progress from English 101 to 103 in almost every category. Students were getting a little bit better as they went through the program. So all the resources and effort to go into the teaching of freshman writing in our program seem to be yielding results. And of course, everyone agrees that writing and communication are core competencies that students should have in their university experience. This data gathering boiled down to very concrete things for us too, because through these conversations we were able to reduce cap sizes. We were able to create course releases for faculty who could do things other than just teach in the program, but could engage in activities, a lot of them assessment related. And it enabled us to get funding and support for some of the faculty training that we were doing because it was directly related to student outcomes. That's one story, and now I'd like to pass it along to Karen and Rebecca to talk about the second piece of this narrative.
Thank you, Scott. And this is Karen Knowlton, the Director of Writing Assessment at Drexel. And Scott's just finished telling us about a fascinating part of our journey where he could do a low-stakes assessment that wasn't resource-intensive, that didn't require external support or buy-in or funding to do. He mined data and made something happen because of it. And what I'm going to tell you about is a very different story. I was hired about 2.5 years ago and asked to create a model for writing at Drexel. We have middle states coming up. That was one thing that helped drive this conversation, but mainly we had very supportive faculty who were behind writing, and they wanted to know, how do we know that we're adding value to our students' writing here at Drexel? And I worked, of course, with Scott and Rebecca, but with a writing task force that represented folks across the university. And we ended up creating the chart that you see here, and we call it the big chart, the yellow chart, the chart of charts. You know, it's been called many things. But what this chart shows is our systematic view of writing here at Drexel. We felt that we needed to start by understanding how writing functioned as a system, how we envisioned that as working so that we could begin with that vision. And let me say, it's not important that you understand all of the pieces of how we're working with writing assessment at Drexel. What is important is that you see we had a plan in place, and that's what allowed us to move forward. Our plan, if you just look briefly at the chart, shows that the freshman writing program is the strong foundation. It's the building block for all of the writing skills that our students get. But we didn't want the conversation to end there, as it so often does. Those of you who work with writing know that oftentimes faculty and students feel like they get inoculated against English in the freshman year, and they never have to look at it again. And that's not the story that we wanted to tell. And the chart helps to show that larger story. That we have writing-intensive courses that are required for graduation, that in those writing-intensive courses and in that central block says professional writing. For us, that's co-op writing. In the writing that we've just instituted as part of the co-op sequence, students are building towards writing in a particular discipline or field. That the goal is that they're able to use what they've learned and gained beginning from the freshman year and beginning with what we teach them in the freshman writing program through what they learn in the writing intensive courses to finally be able to speak to a particular audience that is constituted by a field or discipline. And then we should, of course, since we're a university, be able to look in a sum total of how are we doing with writing, and that's that large oblong at the top. Well, this, of course, this plan necessitated that we have a few things in place. One of the most important thing was a goal. If we're going to say we're all paddling the same way, we'd better be sure what we're paddling toward. So the first thing we needed to do was to create the communication student learning outcomes that are university-wide. And these we created, again, working from the freshman writing program outcomes, looking at WPA outcomes, looking at best practices as best we could, and then getting revisions and buy-in from faculty across the campus, and finally having the provost approve these outcomes and the faculty senate also adopt them. So we were all clear what's our final goal. Well, once we knew where we were headed, we needed to start asking ourselves, how close to that goal are we? And for us, the logical place to start that was in our building block, our foundational spot, which is the freshman writing program. So we knew that we needed an assessment that did two things. The first of which, of course, was to show us where are we adding value to the communication student learning outcomes in the freshman writing program? Where do we leave off so that programs can build on those skills? And that was one piece. But the second piece was specific to our freshman writing program, and that is that our freshman writing program had adopted a writing about writing model, which is essentially a meta-analytic component. We ask students to not only to write, but to write about their writing and about their learning. And we wanted to know whether we had gains in this skill as well. So what we did was institute a pre- and post-assessment to see the value added by the freshman writing program. We collected samples, and this is where having a writing assessment specialist comes in handy. I knew how to create prompts that we could be pretty sure were valid and reliable. And we ended up scoring and working with two different prompts that had two different versions of each of them. So these two scenarios were given in a regular version. Here's your scene. How do you respond to it? And then a guided version where we essentially offered a built-in rubric. I'm not going to talk more about that now, but we'll talk a little bit about that later. The important part of the collection was that we had to assuage some fear of faculty who were worried that we would be sampling their progress and not their students. And that's always a part of conversations about assessment. I think the knee-jerk reaction of many faculties, just like students, towards assessment is one of fear. And you need to expect that, and you need to be ready to work with that, and to keep scaffolding the assessment just as we scaffold our learning for students so that that fear goes away and it becomes part of what's normal. So we gathered our samples the beginning of day one, the end of 103. We worked with internal and external experts to create a rubric based on our communication SLO. We recruited 35 experts. We actually put out a call on the WPA listserv, and of the 90 people who responded, we chose 35 who represented a geographical and sort of academic diversity. So we were sure that we were tapping into some expertise that was not just our own in the scoring. And these folks were paid to participate in an hour-and-a-half scoring training on our scoring rubric, and then to score 60 papers. These papers were loaded into Waypoint, and that made life easy for us because each assessor had 60 papers to score, but the data from all of them was back-gathered via Waypoint. What the scorers didn't know was that 5 of those papers were pre-scored by us so we could get some information about reliability and validity as we were going along the way. So the question, of course, is what did we learn? And here's a chart that shows us something. This chart demonstrates a few things. In 7 of the 11 elements, we had statistically significant gains. That pleased us. In 4 elements, we didn't, and Rebecca will talk a little bit more about what that has meant for us and where we expected that to be the case and where we didn't. But we see that we do have students gaining mostly across the board. The other piece of this chart that I'd like you to pay attention to is that we don't show our students reaching the top. We very consciously and conscientiously said this is the beginning of a long journey. Our students should not be proficient in all of these categories when they end the freshman writing program, or else we could just graduate them then. We need to have room for them to build on those skills. So the scale that we used asked for final competencies, and our students showed improvement in 7 of those competencies, but they didn't show us that they were done growing. And that's great for us because that's part of the conversation that we want to have with the rest of the institution. The next chart, this is just our interesting piece. We discovered many things through this data analysis. One of the ones that I think we all found the most interesting and surprising is the one that I'm going to share with you. I said that we had two different types of prompts, and these prompts were students were asked to articulate how they would compose a process rather than simply writing the process. They wrote about the process that they would take. Rebecca, do you want to explain that one a little bit?
Yeah, we just want to distinguish here. On the very first day of 101, it's often the case that students are asked to submit a writing sample. They're asked a question and they're supposed to write to that question. Rather than that, what we asked them to do was we presented them with a writing task. And we asked them, how would you go about preparing for and conducting this writing task? So we were more interested in understanding the rhetorical habits of mind that they came into 101 with, and then ultimately the rhetorical habits of mind that they left 103 with, in order to get an idea of the kinds of, the ways in which they could think rhetorically, not just in the freshman writing program, but also take those skills with them elsewhere.
So we had two different prompts of this type of assignment that Rebecca talks about, but in one we didn't guide students to responding. And in the other we said consider, and we listed essentially the elements of our student learning outcomes. And we sort of tweaked them. It was like having a built-in rubric where students were asked to focus on what we would focus on as we assessed these pieces. What we found shocked us. I showed you in the previous slide that we had statistically significant gains in 7 of the 11 elements. What we found out when we did an analysis of the guided versus the unguided prompts was that all, and I'll repeat that, all of the statistically significant gains came from the guided prompts. So students were able to demonstrate the knowledge for us so that we could see it only when we helped them along, when they understood exactly what was being asked of them. Now for us, this has tremendous implications for assignments, for the use of rubrics, for helping students with self-assessment as a tool, and we're pretty excited about this. This next year, and we're already gathering data on that, we have guided and we have unguided again, because we want to make sure that we see the same thing again, and we've introduced a middle ground with just a little nudge along the path, and we want to see how much guidance students need in order to be able to demonstrate their knowledge. But we've had a lot of fun looking at the results from our assessment. And Rebecca will talk a little bit now about what we have done and will be doing with those fun results.
Right. So here's just a little bit on how we've applied what we've learned from this assessment right away. After we relayed the details of our analysis to some of the administrative folks that were involved, we wanted to share it with faculty in the program right away. So in the summer, before the school year begins, we hold a freshman writing program workshop, and the faculty who teach in the program attend this workshop all together. It's a great way to bring people together pedagogically and to create community. And Karen detailed the results of the assessment for them and did a couple of things. One, it revealed to them what we were doing as a program, what we were doing well, which I think is really important, and especially as you're about to start the school year. Here's what we're doing. We know we're doing it well. We have the data to back it up. But it also revealed, and in kind of a timely way, here are the areas where we need to offer a little more focus in our curriculum. In terms of conversation outside of the freshman writing program, this goes back to some of the things Karen was talking about. Remember that the outcomes for the freshman writing program are actually derived from university-wide student learning priorities for communication. We took those priorities and we made them matter to our particular programs. They're a direct reflection of those. So this immediately starts the conversation across the university. The other thing, and this you could see from the chart, students clearly have room to grow, which again makes the argument that the FWP, the freshman writing program, is not a service to students' university careers. It is an anchor in their careers. Additionally, sort of related to this, related to the outcomes, is that we're really trying to cultivate a conversation about writing across the curriculum at Drexel, and this assessment certainly helped to foster that, not only in a cultural, discursive kind of collaborative way, but also, again, we have the evidence to show for it, that writing begins in the FWP, but it is then reinforced as students progress through sophomore, junior, senior year, and into their pre-professional experiences. Turning back to the program in terms of teaching tools for us, because visual literacy was an area that didn't show as much gain as, really didn't show gain. We wanted it to show gain and it didn't. That made me and the folks with whom I collaborate to create the core syllabus that encouraged us to filter into the syllabus a much stronger scaffolding around visual literacy. And I've done that in the 101, the fall syllabus, and in the winter 102 syllabus. And in terms of mechanics, this was kind of interesting. There's two different ways in which we were able to look at student mechanics. One way is that when you're dealing with your outcomes, you're trying to assess your outcomes, it actually makes you look more critically at your outcomes. And when we were assessing the data, we noticed that students actually didn't seem to be struggling that much in terms of mechanics. Okay, great. But it also showed us that we need to bring mechanics more to the forefront in our outcomes. It was kind of assumed, but it wasn't really standing on its own as an outcome. So that's encouraged us to actually create an outcome around it. But the second issue is that we have found in talking with faculty that oftentimes when faculty refer to students writing problems, they're often referring to students' mechanics. But this data shows, obviously, that the issues aren't really about mechanics. They're about larger, more substantive things. So this actually helps us to change culturally the perspective on students' writing and the ways in which students need to develop their writing. And certainly, again, makes an argument that we have a shared, across the disciplines, we have a shared responsibility in terms of helping students to cultivate those skills. Portfolios and reflective analysis. So this assessment that we did looked at students' rhetorical habits of mind. It was a meta-analysis. What we now want to look at, in addition, is students' ability to actually enact these writing processes. So they talked about them in this assessment. Now we want to see what they do when they actually sit down and write effectively about their own writing development and about using and using their own writing as evidence for those arguments. So the portfolio is an evidence-based, the reflective analysis of the portfolio is an evidence-based argument that they make about their own development. And again, it points back to the outcomes because each of them chooses an outcome to focus on. And then finally, publication for us as a program, for us as scholars, this initiative that we've taken on has caused us to think really creatively about how to communicate it back to our field. And so we're actually working on that together in terms of writing up this data and relaying the story and hopefully helping others who'd like to do something similar at their institutions. So we have one more story to tell, and I'm going to go ahead and pass it back to Scott.
Thank you. So to pick up from the writing across the curriculum discussion that Rebecca and Karen were having, I'd like to talk finally about our work with the Lebeau College of Business at Drexel. So several years ago, like most colleges of business in the United States, Lebeau was faced with its accreditation with the AACSMB. So they have great leadership in Lebeau, very forward thinking about education. And one of the people I have to shout out to here is Dr. Frank Linehan. And working together, Lebeau came up with a number of key goals that they were trying to achieve. And one of those was writing. So they chose writing as a key goal. And then they came to us in the English department to look for ways to develop a methodology to using accreditation as a kind of a useful tool to inspire them to think more about the writing in their programs. So they came to us and we developed a method of assessing the writing in Lebeau that I'll discuss here. And this is based on the idea of situated assessment, which is simply the idea that we didn't norm our assessors for this assessment because we wanted it to be reproducible year to year. And if you go back to that slide about the kind of race of assessment, I mean, one of the things is you might do a great assessment one year, but then the resources, cost, personnel will prevent you from doing it again. So we wanted a reproducible model that we could use every year. So situated assessment is simply to use the subjectivity of readers' natural responses to writing as an asset rather than a problem. So we gave very little training and just asked what we felt were the competent people to read Lebeau business documents. And the idea was that they would evaluate them using waypoint rubrics. And because we would use such large numbers, that aggregate number would create for us a statistically meaningful profile of the writing of the undergraduate students in Lebeau. In 2006, we piloted the assessment just to make sure all the moving parts worked, and they did. And then we've undergone the full-scale assessment since 2007. The data I'm going to describe here is up till 2010. We, again, haven't described our 2011 data yet. So the mechanics of how we did this, each year Lebeau gathers and then anonymizes 600 student writing projects from across its curriculum. We chose 30 assessors, and early on we decided to do this, and this actually yielded some interesting results for us. We decided we'd pick 15 with a background in English, largely teachers of writing at Drexel University, and 15 from industry. Some of these are Lebeau faculty, others are alumni who volunteered to help Lebeau with this endeavor. And by the way, Lebeau alumni have been quite eager to help in this project every year. Each assessor receives 20 projects, and they all receive a $100 stipend, a $100 honorarium basically, and in fact many of the alumni give it back. So the assessment budget, the complete assessment budget, is having waypoint and then $3,000 for the assessors each year. Everything was done online. It was a 1-hour online training. There was no norming again. We basically showed them the Lebeau writing rubric, which was loaded into waypoint, and this is a fairly standard rubric about writing in many ways, although we added a couple different kind of elements. We added it was a 5-point scale from excellent to unacceptable, but we also had two 2-point scales, and those were gross mistakes and ethics, figuring people, especially from industry, would read a document and might have a kind of binary response, whether something is, in terms of gross mistakes and ethics, is it there or isn't it? Everything was distributed electronically, and we've improved our methodology in that way, going from emailing the documents to using Gmail this past summer. This has yielded a treasure trove of data for us, and just a snippet of it is represented here. Again, we've been working on this since 2007, and we've looked at over 1,100 documents. We've had over 100 assessors up till 2010. They're split pretty fairly between business and English. We don't get the full number of assessments every year. There's always some little snags in the system, so we don't quite get 600 assessments. We normally get around 540. So there's a total, as you can see, of over 2,100 assessments total for those 4 years. We sampled documents from 6 different majors within the Lebeau College of Business, and this has provided us with opportunities to do all kinds of things. Very, very quickly, we had a control group one year in University 101 where we asked one group to do the conventional kind of experience that these students had in that course. Another group was an experimental group where they had smaller sections, they had a peer review process that was more rigorous, the teachers were in teaching circles, and there was sequencing the assignments, and we were able to put those into the general body of the assessment, and lo and behold, we discovered that, this will probably be no surprise to anyone, that experimental group, the students did better across the board. But it was very interesting to validate that in the assessment as just having a part of what we were doing in a larger sense. What was very interesting was, and again, this is just reproduced a little piece of the data, and you can see that the bars represent each year. There's some consistency, some slight variation, but they're basically consistent, which kind of validates the assessment as we go from year to year. And incidentally, if you're looking, in the waypoint rubrics we've been using, the range of good on the 5-point scale, say you're B, falls between 0.67 and 0.75. So you can get a little sense of that as you look at these bars to see where these evaluators are finding the documents for ethics, evidence, gross mistakes, and visuals, the 4 you're looking at. But what we found, which was very interesting because it lined up with our earlier freshman writing program experience, was that the students were again lowest in the use of research and evidence. They consistently came in, consistently showed up as the lowest element score in these assessments with all of these documents. As you can see, it's floating in that 0.62 to 0.69 range, and that's consistently stayed, in general, that's been one of the lower elements compared to the rest. And ethics and gross mistakes have stayed closer to a 0.85, even better than a good score, generally saying, I suppose, that these documents are free of gross mistakes and don't have ethical issues. In terms of the action based on this data, there's been a great deal of it, and one of the things was that Lebeau, of course, was able to use this for accreditation purposes. But how is the student writing in your program? That's a question we want to ask here, and that conversation is largely driven by anecdote. People just don't know. But in fact, Lebeau does have a sense of this. They use this data quite prolifically. They show it on their website. They've talked about it a great deal and used it to drive some meetings and some other initiatives, curriculum initiatives. We have the statistical profile of these writers. And what's interesting here is the quality question. You know, I said that between 0.67 and 0.75 is good, and that's really up for the faculty in that school to determine, is that acceptable where these students are falling for all these different categories. The research and evidence piece, because it was low, was something that, you know, we could definitely agree upon in terms of moving forward. And that piece, we are now currently working with Lebeau in 2 of the courses, one a freshman course, Business 101, and one a junior level course, Organizational Behavior, working with faculty in a writing across the curriculum type style to enhance the teaching of research and evidence in those courses, the hopes of improving students' ability to use research and evidence, and then next summer that will be incorporated into these anonymized documents, and we'll actually see if we have an uptick in this. Of course, and I can only say a word about this briefly, is we also found very interesting differences between the 2 assessor populations, between English and industry. And those differences varied some years, but it was interesting to look at how those 2 different assessment populations really looked at this large data set. And we have a lot more now analytical work to do with that, because there definitely are differences that we could draw out to discuss. So overall, kind of closing up here to allow some questions to flow, we've been able to generate a campus conversation based upon data for writing programs and for writing across curriculum initiatives. If you want to sum up the models, we've got this sustainable culture of assessment because we're thinking about assessment. A lot of people are talking about assessment. It's providing an opportunity for people to get together and think about what they're doing with their programs driven by data. Formal and grassroots assessment it's underlying what we're doing here, because we've got some formalized projects like what Rebecca and Karen described, and also some grassroots efforts like what we described earlier with first-year humanities, where we were able just to aggregate the data using Waypoint to show what we had and what was happening in our classrooms. Of course, Waypoint's integrated with our LMS. We're a Blackboard Vista school, and that's assisted in a number of ways. Those of you invested in writing, and it seems a number of you are based on the attendees, this became a great way for writing to be a key kind of link for a number of campus initiatives. We just listed a variety of committees that writing personnel have a seat at this table because we have data-driven ways of describing what happens in our own programs and of helping other programs think about what they're doing. We have ways of going forth and, like we did with Lebeau, creating a profile and creating these great kind of campus partnerships to talk about writing in ways that we hope are integral to the educational experience of Drexel students. So this idea of using the data to build consensus, to build dialogue, we've been able to have conversations with a variety of people, and I think that, you know, this one little evidence piece keeps coming back to us, and it's really been a great little toehold for all of us to talk about ways that we can think about the writing-intensive courses at Drexel, to think about the freshman writing program experience, and to think about what they're doing in the various disciplinary writing courses that they take around the university. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Andrew to talk about some questions, and hopefully we can provide some answers and commentary. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott. There are no questions. We can all go home now. No, there are a considerable number, and I've been sort of collating them and putting them in order as they've rolled in. So let me start with a softball to Karen and Rebecca. A couple of questions asking if the prompts that you used would be made available or are already available publicly on the web.
Yeah, it's a good question. They're not available right now. I think after we finish this year's trial and we've sort of set our piece, they will be available. Rebecca, is that a fair statement?
Yeah, and I think we're still kind of thinking about how, you know, to sort of package this assessment and make it public, and we're thinking about that together in conversation. We're also thinking about that in terms of publishing about it too.
Great. Yeah. So certainly some real interest in sharing all of that work with the community. A good discussion point, given that we have really, and it was part of the purpose here in putting the panel together, really very different approaches. So a couple of questions around, quote, the rationale behind not norming. So Scott, I think that's, you know, kind of a discussion, which I'm sure you've had many times with Karen and others, around the situated assessment approach in Lebeau, where people just choose and figure it out as best they can versus a training approach in the first year writing that Karen and Rebecca spoke to. So Karen, maybe you should take that first, and you know, do you have a perspective on the Lebeau work and and situated assessment as a strategy?
Oh, shoot. I think Scott's going to have to speak to that one. My background, my comfort, and my expertise is in normed assessment. So that's where I'm comfortable speaking, and that's why the freshman writing program assessment looks the way that it does. But Scott, I think, is pretty convincing about the value of the unnormed. Do you want to talk about that a little bit, Scott?
Definitely. Yeah. I mean, this was, again, harking back to the early slide about the assessment race, I mean, this is a great question that I've gotten a lot, and I wrote a piece up that was in the Journal of Business and Technical Communication about our pilot effort with this, and we have another one in the works about the 5-year data collection that we'll have after this summer. And I likened the use of not norming to, I had a background as a medical writer, to an orthopedic pain scale, which may sound kind of funny until you think about it, that, pain, of course, is very subjective, right? And in doing orthopedic writing for years and years, I'd write about, different implants, and they would have these pain scales and measurements of pain. And, of course, I'm a real softie, so any implant I had would hurt me, tremendously. But, Andrew, you're pretty sturdy, and you would say it doesn't hurt at all, so that wouldn't mean much. But we have 10,000 patients who produce those kind of data points. Now we have an overall scale that we can kind of talk about the level for this implant. So we used a kind of similar analogy actually in the article about situated assessment, which is that, sure, there's going to be anybody who's done any kind of faculty development about writing and has been in the room with a sample paper where the range of grades has been from A to F will know that individual differences between faculty can be acute. Our idea, it was driven by the fact that we had a tool, really, a data gathering tool, that is Waypoint, to gather this information in an aggregate way so we could get a lot of data points. And we felt that if we got a lot of data points, that we could figure out that we could elide out some of those differences and some of those subjective peculiarities that are the nature of any assessment. And in fact, it seems that that's been the case because there's some consistency from year to year in these different kind of data groups, and that we found out when we did a control and experimental study that the experimental group was higher in every level, again, with completely anonymized documents. So the idea driving it, I think norming in a way, I mean, Karen has her strength in norming. It would be ideal, I guess, if you could have a really strong normed assessment all the time. But the problem is many people drop out of the race right there. You just simply can't do it. It's very resource heavy to norm. And if you have a structure like that has been set up in the freshman writing program assessment we described here, that's great. But to do something every year for your program, most places won't be able to do that. It'll become cost prohibitive, time prohibitive. We'd have to gather the assessors every year, many of whom are alumni just helping out. So we felt that situated assessment, because of the large number of data points, could work for this.
And that's where you need to think about your goals. So in the FWP, we had 2 goals, or we do moving forward. And one of those goals is faculty development. Norming is a great tool for faculty development, and so it costs a little more. Scott's tool doesn't cost as much, and you don't get that faculty development or consensus. Well, you don't have to have one or the other. There are times when either approach would be appropriate.
And what's really interesting is when you can start to look at the different data streams and see if they agree, disagree, et cetera, which is the position that you all are in. Excellent. Thank you for that answer. Rebecca,
yes.
The guided, unguided, I think is I'm impressed by the questions coming in. People really understood that. It's a complicated, not complicated, but it's a lot to digest amidst all this other information. So a really good question around guided and unguided. The question is, how can you test in an unbiased way when you're prompting students toward the answer you want? Which seems, to me, you're kind of wrapping around yourself, because that is the goal of education, right? To describe expectations and show people the way. But you must have talked about that, so I'm curious if you could respond to that question.
Well, I mean, I think the question, it's such a good question, because it almost feels, for lack of a better word, icky. I mean, they're showing us what we want them to show us when we're giving them the rubric. But in some ways, and Karen and Scott can probably speak to this too, but I think it's about students learning to self-scaffold.
Right.
So when Karen likes to talk about a rubric system in terms of shelves, so I'm going to borrow that, Karen. A rubric is shelves. So when students think in terms of rubric, they're actually thinking about where to put information and where to pull information. And when students go into a rhetorical situation and they're trying to scope out, I mean, genre analysts are doing this right now, thinking about how students go in and inhabit scenes of writing or genres of writing. They're starting to we want them to be able to scaffold that for themselves. Okay, what is my first step in this writing task? What is my second step in this writing task? What are the various elements of the rhetorical situation that I should think about? I mean, when we give students the rhetorical situation itself is a rubric. So I think partly it's about asking what we want from them, but it's also about giving them skills so that they can enter scenes and create a scaffolding for themselves.
And
Karen, what do you want to add there?
Well, that scaffolding has become part of the freshman writing program training, right, where we have trained our faculty and asked them to help their students to create the rubrics themselves. So that one of our teaching moments is students creating the rubric for the assignment that they will then be assessed on. So they begin to understand that, the powers that be don't have to tell them what they need to do. They can pull that information out from the task, but they need our help to do that.
One of the fascinating things for me in putting this together and thinking about Drexel's engagement is certainly the pedagogy, but then you've also got the mechanics of just how does this all work. And we worked pretty hard to have transparency around the costs and how much effort went into things. So a couple of questions around mechanics. One, and they're related. One, did you consider, rather than creating your own rubrics, using the value rubrics from AAC and U? And why not use something like Google Forms rather than a tool like Waypoint? I'll tee that one up for you guys.
The rubric question, we checked out, first of all, the easy answer is we needed to assess our communication student learning outcomes, which means that we needed a Drexel-specific rubric.
Right.
But we did look at all of the other possibilities out there, but we looked at them when we created the learning outcomes so that the goals of those rubrics were already part of our learning outcomes, if that makes sense.
Well, and you've certainly one of the big breaks with the value rubric, which I think is very helpful to people, is the idea that a first-year student should be a 1 or a 2 on the scale of 1 to 4, which is something that you've built in as well. Whereas a lot of rubrics, we want to give people a 3.5 out of 4 or 5.5 out of 6 right out of the gate, and they aren't scaffolded through the curriculum. They're just kind of one-off assessments. And how about Scott? You've been involved in a lot of technology, e-learning. The question about Google Forms, it's a fair one. I understand that as a curiosity or a question. So what about alternative tools for collecting this kind of data?
Well, I don't want to, I don't know enough about Google Forms to tell you the truth, Andrew. I know that it's funny, like the little data charts are showing her easily created, we've been using Waypoint for this for years and years and years. We're familiar with it. It's designed exactly for this purpose. So, and by the way, it's not just for assessment. The thing that's an advantage for this is that Waypoint, was able to be used in class. So, and it had a data aggregation engine behind it. And I guess if you had something that could do that, sure. But for us, that would seem like a ramping up. We're familiar with this, and we're able to transfer the technology piece of this from the freshman writing program, the humanities program material. We were familiar with Waypoint, so we could then use it for Lebeau, and then we were able to plug it into this assessment we just did this summer that Karen and Rebecca described. So I don't know if that's, I can't do a point-by-point comparison because I'm not familiar enough with how Google Forms would work for this.
But just a shout-out, if you're thinking about it, you should think about all alternatives. Just think about IRB as well and make sure you can ensure the confidentiality of whatever tool that you use. That's all.
That's actually a great point. I have to tell you that this month's Atlantic Monthly has a piece by James Fallows about his Google email account being hacked. And as you know, there was just an article about, an institution in Georgia that just they ruled that they can't use wikis anymore in their classroom and blogs in their classes because of FERPA violations. So it's interesting. You really do want to make sure you're secure at whatever you use.
Does Drexel, particularly first-year writing, use a validated course evaluation instrument? So I suppose that's getting at looking at validation or confirmation from students looking at their own learning.
Yeah, right now we're in the process of changing over. Is that fair to say, everyone, our course evaluation instrument? Because Drexel as a whole is looking at course evaluations as a larger project. So what we have now and what we'll have in a year or two probably won't be the same. So no, we don't have that now. What we will have, I don't think we know.
Right, whether it's one of the big curriculum-wide shared course evaluation surveys or one that you develop yourselves. Yeah, absolutely. One of the huge themes to the questions or comments that the registrants completed as they signed up to attend the webinar was around faculty buy-in, a culture of assessment. Some of the comments were a little more candid than that. But if you think of that faculty buy-in question, and particularly across the institution, how the three of you have seen that play out.
Can I, Rebecca, I know that you're going to have wonderful things to say. I just want to start out because for me that was the most important part of this process. And that was simply walking around with a yellow legal pad, pre-computer, and talking to folks in different, in schools and departments and saying, what's up with writing? How is it going? How is writing for your students? What's going well? What's frustrating you? What supports could we put in place for those things that are frustrating you? And what we found over and over again was the message was, we are frustrated occasionally with our students' writing, but we want to do something about it. And once they had been asked about their hopes and what supports would help, once those supports came into place, they didn't look at them with suspicion. I think it's just so important to hear people before you give them a solution. Rebecca, did you want to?
Yeah, wonderful things to say. I mean, I think faculty buy-in is complicated, and I think it's something that we're still working on. One of the things that I'm noticing, and I mean, one of the things we're working on right away, is that I think faculty need to understand how they are stakeholders in a larger process. Because we can say to them, when you get students, when you do this assessment in your classroom, you're going to get a really good idea about where students are, the rhetorical habits of mind that they're coming into your classroom with. When you conduct this assessment at the end of year 103, that's going to be great teacher reflection for you, in terms of, what kind of skills are your students leaving with. So there's an opportunity for students to reflect and for teachers to reflect, but I think that it's still, unless you help the faculty understand that they play a role in a larger system, a very critical role in a larger system, I think to them it can sometimes feel like an add-on and something that they're being asked to do and not really knowing why they're doing it. I think we made some headway this year when we were able to show them, here's what the analysis of the data shows. I think we're going to make some more headway when we're able to say, here's how we're going to assess portfolios and here's how we'd like you to participate in that assessment. We'll make some more headway when we can show them to be experts in this kind of assessment and that they are going to become a model for other endeavors across the university. But many of us say here that we're building the plane as we're flying it, and I think sometimes it's about, we'd like you to do this. We don't really yet have a system to show you exactly where you're located in that, but we promise we will. And so they don't always happen at the same time. So for us, now in our second year of the assessment, we're now going into our, I think, third year of portfolio. I think people are starting to understand where they're located in the larger project, and that is helping buy-in.
Well, and a lot of times at institutions, it's, oh my goodness, SACs are coming, or ABET is coming, or ACSB is coming, and that's how faculty are introduced to all of this. And part of what you've done is make it about writing. And you'd be hard-pressed if you got any educator backed into a corner to have them say that writing isn't important. That just doesn't matter. Why should I care about it? They may look at it as someone else's responsibility. Please deliver them to my doorstep with excellent writing skills, but at least they're bought into it as being valuable, right?
Andrew, if you want to go to another question, that's fine.
Well, we've got time for one more, but go ahead, Scott.
I was just going to say that you're mentioning accreditation again is, it's really key to this, and I think in terms of, these external kind of drives, and with the Lebeau, it was, their accreditor, and instead of seeing this as like this onerous process and people getting all worked up, it was like, hey, here's an opportunity. Here's an opportunity. We have to do this, so let's use this as an opportunity to see if we can find out what we're doing in these different areas. Again, writing was just one of 4 areas they chose, so they're doing all kinds of interesting things over there. But it was, and there's all kinds of things like that can happen. And if you get faculty, hey, look, people, the people I work with around here, they want students they want to help student learning, but the disjunction is this assessment that you're proposing. How's that going to help? Mm-hmm. So we really try to tie that in with, these are really reasonable ways of trying to see what's happening. And if you have that kind of metric, then I think faculty start to get it. I mean, because they're invested in the process. They just don't want to do something that doesn't have an outcome or an action-oriented result.
It's with them. What's in it for me? I guess is part of the answer. So a final question, and this is one I've never thought of. Really, it's intriguing. Are some learning outcomes more important to the university than others? And do you think it is better to focus on growing strengths or building up weaknesses?
Oh, what a good question.
Either you two can jump on it, or I'll go.
This massive silence means great question, and we don't really have an answer. And probably when you don't know the answer, usually what we say is do what feels best for you. Do where you are led.
Here's one answer. One answer is to leverage them against each other. So to demonstrate strengths and to use those strengths that students are already, showing as a way to make a case for more resources to bolster the weaknesses. And I think that has been we've certainly taken that approach. I think it's got to be both, but they've got to be used, one can be used to push the other forward, if that makes sense.
I think that's a great comment. I want to follow up on that because I think that's right, is that, one of the issues is, of course, and it's key here, again, we use the word anecdote several times, like a lot of strengths and weaknesses are purely anecdotal, and that's the value of data. Yeah. I mean, no one here is saying that the data here is ironclad. I'm certainly not saying that about any of the data that I'm representing here. It's a picture, and it's a picture with a lot of narrative around it. But it certainly helped inform a lot of our discussions and decision making. And again, this evidence piece was just so fascinating that we drew evidence as the weakest element in two totally different sets. Freshman writing program experience, and then the whole Lebeau College of Business. So if I think that you can look, and then it's kind of identifying, like, in a real way, what your strengths and weaknesses are, not just driven by anecdote. And if you have that, and we have chosen, and I guess initially you think we're going to work on everything, but we have this low point in the evidence, and we've tried to focus on that. And so I guess in a way we have gone for that area where we think we need the most work, because it's an area where perhaps we can really do the best for students in terms of gains.
It is an insightful question, because if it was one of our, I think we'd all agree that evidence and information literacy is a top outcome, right? So if the weakest one had come out to be something we sort of intrinsically or just didn't care about as much, even though we might not state it that way, it's written in the same font on the page, but it isn't one that we value as much. I think it's a clever question, because it's sort of like children. I love all my children equally. Well, that's true, but then everybody's different, and, it depends what day it is and whatnot. So it is a really interesting question, and a really good way to finish, I think, because it's an open-ended question that leads us to more investigation and deeper thinking about these challenges. So I'd very much like to thank the Chronicle of Higher Education and our panel for all the time and effort put into this, and for all of the attendees today. For those of you who joined us a little bit late and asked, this will be available to you. You'll get an email follow-up with a link so that you can listen to this and share it with your colleagues. And again, we thank you all for joining us, and have a great rest of your day. Take care, everyone.